Why are people on the planet? Why are you here? Where did we all come from? And what happens after we die? Hi, this is Sarah Russell. I'm your microdose host, here with your weekly mood boost and tools for transformation. In today's episode, I'll be talking about why our culture is so afraid of death. I've had the death conversation with my mom, and it goes something like this. Hey, Mom, you're never allowed to die. I'd miss you too much, so you need to stick around. And she goes, how dare you put that on me? Don't you dare hold me back. My mom's a Sagittarius. She doesn't like anybody pinning her down. She likes to go on her adventures. And she's like, I need to know what's next. So here's the thing. I've done work on death and dying and aging and facing the unknown. And I'm deeply indebted to Nancy Chanteau for much of this episode and the work we've done together around all of these concepts. But here's the thing. I still have work to do around that, but I also have a tremendous amount of work to do around losing the people that I love. Because not only do I want to handle my death with dignity and grace and skill, I want to be able to handle the aging and the diminished capacity and the passing of those I love with dignity and grace and skill. And these are conversations that we avoid. They're tough consequences that we don't want to contemplate. And it makes us really uncomfortable. But that discomfort and that avoiding of that discomfort leaves us really unprepared. And we want to be really resourced when the moment arrives, because all of a sudden, when death or aging or diminished capacity or disability or some kind of accident or loss arrives, our capacity is diminished in those moments. And if we're trying to craft a response with diminished capacity, it's going to be much, much harder than if we've done it when we're really resourced. And everybody's terrified of death. And that makes sense because death is coming for us all. And here's the thing, is death is actually around us all day, every day, across so many of our relationships. We experience the death of a relationship. We experience disease. We experience accident and disability. We're bumping up against the unknown and change all of the time. But even though it's happening all the time, most people are avoiding death. And we're constantly coming into contact with death, and yet we're completely unprepared to deal with it. Now, why do we avoid this so much? Why as a culture are we so afraid of this? Part of it has to do with the fact that we have a lot of shame and internalized oppression and external oppression around being weak, being perceived as weak, being perceived as sick, being perceived as ill in some way. And this is because of eugenics. And eugenics has this idea that only the strong survive, that only the strong deserve to survive, and that as a culture, we should be pushing everybody toward this standard of perfection that is incredibly life-draining and doesn't take into account a wide array of humanity's experiences and what creates value and meaning on this earth. Also, with death, we're experiencing real scarcity. We're experiencing real loss. And we're bumping up against the unknown. And the unknown is very difficult for us. So death is the ultimate unknown, right? And Daniel Kahneman talks about the unknown in his work with System 1 and System 2 thinking, the way that the brain works. So in System 1 thinking, we're organizing around a lot of knowns. And when we're organizing around a lot of knowns, we're doing a lot of past analysis in order to predict future eventualities or possibilities rather. And it's very intuitive and it's very quick and it requires very little effort, which means biologically we are geared to try to default to System 1 as much as possible. System 2 is slow and it's conscious and it requires a lot more effort. It's really how we organize around the unknown, and organizing around the unknown, it takes so much more energy that's not super efficient for the body. So we're constantly, the brain and the body is constantly trying to pull us into System 1 thinking. This is what I know. I'm going to do what I've always done. This is why change is so hard. This is why facing our death is so hard. And here's the thing, with death, we really don't know because nobody's come back from the other side in order to tell us what it's really like. And the major world religions have offered some answers around all of this, but really they're stories. They're our best guesses about what's possibly happening on the other side, how we get there, what happens once we get there, what happens afterwards. And so these are just stories that we're telling ourselves. And we're telling, like, this is what we do. We're storytelling creatures. And we especially like to tell stories when we don't know. We like to fill in the blanks because then we can try to move it towards like this kind of shadow of the known. Because the unknown makes us bump up against our powerlessness. And powerlessness feels really dangerous and really scary in our bodies. And when we experience that fear of powerlessness, it kicks off our survival strategies. So we go into fight, flight, freeze, fawn, dissociate, because we're trying to control our powerlessness in some way. We're trying to have some control over what we have no control over. Also, the culture has a pretty pejorative view on aging. And part of that is because we're operating under late stage capitalism, and late stage capitalism tells us that our worth is tied up with our productivity. And in capitalism, there's this hyper productivity, right? We're always supposed to be generating and creating. That's how we create value and meaning in our lives under the values of capitalism. Also, we're told that as we age, we become less sexy, right? All of a sudden, we're told we're less attractive in some way, which is complete and utter bullshit. And yet this is how we're organizing as a culture. So we're like, I'm going to try to avoid that as much as possible. We have this youth culture where we're supposed to pretend like we're in our mid-20s forever. And for those of you that had wonderful mid-20s, I'm so happy for you. I was one of those people that had a great set of mid-20s. And yet it can get better. It does get better. You can build more of the ability to choose your responses rather than just come from reactivity. You can start reevaluating what your values were and how you want to organize your life moving forward rather than letting the people in your life tell you how you should be living your life. There's all kind of power and wisdom and resourcing that comes from aging, but as a culture, we diminish all of that. And we're like, no, you're supposed to pretend like you don't know anything still and you're going to be young forever. Not my favorite. Okay, so here's the thing. We also don't have this kind of eldership, this kind of council of elders that's going, hey, this is the best way to age. We have all this wisdom. We have all these resources. We have all of these skill sets, and we like to share them with you. The older elders teaching the younger elders how to transition. And if we're not figuring out how to transition into old age before we're already old, it's going to be a lot harder once we get there, because here's the thing, there is diminished capacity, right? There is a loss of resourcing in some way. And so if we're trying to figure out all of the answers once we're already there, it's going to be a lot harder than if we're doing it when we have maximum resourcing, when there's the most wellness or health or capacity in our bodies, in our minds, in our hearts. That's when we should be crafting a plan for old age, so we're not getting there and going, oh, fuck, like I didn't figure this out and now I don't have as much resources in order to deal with this. So it's easier to do it now. What are you afraid of? What's hard to look at? What would it mean to bring flowers to your fears and invite your demons to tea? Are you willing to face your dying? Are you willing to do it before you're actually in the process of dying? Because I would highly recommend that you don't wait until that moment to get ready for it. And you know who had a really hard time with the idea of death and dying and aging? Voldemort. That's right. Complete evil. Split his soul into 9 pieces in this horrific way as a way to never die. So we all know how that turned out. I would highly recommend choosing another path. So how are you going to make friends with death and disease and dying and loss of ability and the unknown? How are you going to figure out how to let go of people? How are you going to accept the next stage, both for yourself and for the people that you love? We want to be able to do that, again, with as much skill and dignity as possible, both for ourselves and the people that we love. What do you do when people die? What do you do when they're experiencing disease or accident and disability? How do you deal with it when the people in your life are aging and losing capacity? So these questions really revolve around what's happening in life and how we deal with the consequences of what's happening in life, and what are the consequences of not dealing with it. So how can we deal with this? So this is what Nancy Shanto recommends for how we can deal with death, for how we can make a death plan. How do you define death? What does death mean to you? How do you want to die? And how do you want to treat yourself? And how do you want to be treated? And part of this is coming up with the ideal, right? So maybe you die at home, in your bed. You've lived an incredibly satisfying life. You're surrounded by people that love you. You have no regrets. It's good to have the dream. But it's also good to be prepared for if the worst happens. What happens if you're alone? What happens if you're in pain? We still want to be able to handle that. We still want to be able to face our death. We still want to be prepared in those moments. So how can you stay curious and open and allow the unknown to unfold rather than clinging to all the knowns of life? We each need to figure out the answer to that question. So what's your relationship with the unknown? And here are some questions that Nancy asks. How does death affect you? What's the meaning of life? Why are we here? How is it to relate with someone else's death? What does that do to you in your own body? What does it do to you when somebody's sick or getting divorced? Have you thought about what it's like to be sick, divorced, laid off, or disabled? How do you make the most out of the life you've got? Are you going to give up, or are you going to accept the unacceptable, then choose your response? So dealing with death looks like, who are you in this body? When this body dies, who is left? What do you believe? Not knowing is okay. We can't know. We can let not knowing in. We can let our relationship with loss in. We can let our relationship with death and the dying of this body in. And then we decide what we want to do with that. What does it mean to be alive? And what happens after you die? Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. You can also go check out trendswithbenefits.com to read all of our written work as well as sign up for our newsletter. And if you have any questions about any of the relationships in your life, please send me a voice memo to podcast@mudwtr.com, where I'd be happy to offer you some support on this podcast. And as a special thank you to all of our listeners, we're offering a special discount code just for you. It's BOOST25 for 25% off your first order of our new product, Mushroom Boost. And as Dumbledore says to the well-organized mind, death is but the next great adventure.